So I'm looking forward, I hope we are looking forward toward this. Have a very good evening. I think atmosphere is extremely well here during Slovak presidency, but also because of you and your presence here. And thank you very much for this. And have a good evening and good dessert after lecture. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here, great honor to be invited, and great pleasure to meet the commissioner. Because I'm a big admirer of a big idea, which I used to call the Juncker idea, but now I know that's I will talk about that later. So it's about rethinking growth, the Schumpeterian perspective. And the motivation for this, of course, for all of us, is to say, why is Europe not growing as fast as the US in particular? Why, after the crisis, you know, we are on a kind of flat growth, a kind of very low growth path in Europe? And in particular, the skepticism, you have Brexit, or you have various governments in Europe that show, you know, distrust in Europe, because Europe is not delivering growth. And so the big problem is how you can deliver growth. Of course, when Europe doesn't deliver what you expect it would, how can people trust it? After the war, you know, Europe was a big, you had the Marshall Plan, you had the European Union created, and you had a high growth period, and people believed in Europe because it was delivering things for them. And of course, if Europe stops delivering for them, of course they are skeptical. And so Europe has to deliver again. And let's see how we can look at it. So I am I developed over the past 30 years what we now call Schumpeterian growth theory, because Schumpeter existed, but there was no Schumpeterian model or any test of Schumpeterian models before I started to work on this. So here is Schumpeter, okay? So he's not this next door, in Austria, he's not far. He's a neighbor. And so with my friend Peter Howitt, 30 years ago, I developed a theory based on three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth results from innovation. That's the first idea, okay? And you need innovation for long-run growth. Capital accumulation would not give you long-run growth, as Bob Solow had shown, okay? Second idea, innovation do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities, from entrepreneurial investment. And those are shaped by the business climate. So institutions and policies will impact on growth because they will impact on the incentives of people to engage in R&D activities or other type of innovative activities. So policy matters for growth, okay? Are you still with me? If I lose you,
sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. So third idea, it's a creative destruction. New technologies replace old technologies, and so it means that growth is a conflictual process between the old and the new. And there is something called the political economy of growth. The innovators of yesterday tend to become the entrenched incumbents of today, and they will try to prevent new innovations because they want to keep their market. So you still, the whole challenge for governments is to at the same time give incentives for people to become innovators, to give them grants, but make sure that they don't use these grants to later on prevent new innovators from coming in. And that's the whole difficulty of the exercise, okay? And we will see this coming again and again. Okay, so those are the basic ideas. So now, the thing is that the kind of very simplistic view of the theory said if you need innovation grants to be innovator, competition policy should be bad because competition reduces monopoly grants. So if you, kind of very simplistic way of understanding the theory would be that you don't want competition, you want patent protection, but you don't want competition. And you would believe that competition has a decreasing effect on innovation and growth. But in fact, the evidence is that competition is good for innovation-based growth. And why it's good for innovation-based growth is because I did that work with Richard Blondel, who is a very good the best microeconometrician in Europe, and we do econometrics with him. And the idea is the following. Suppose you are a classroom. In fact, it's because, you see, and in the classroom, I know you are all equally good, but suppose that some are better than others. So, suppose I open the door and I bring a very good element in the class, what will happen? Those who are very good, they will work harder to beat the entrant. Those are the blue firms here. You see the blue firms? Those are the ones, you know, it's like, firms are like a classroom, you know. The good firms, those who are frontier in their sector, they react to more entry and more competition by innovating more to beat the entrants. But there are those behind, the laggards. Those already are discouraged, and if you bring a good element in the class, they will be further discouraged. And those are the red firms. And it's true in classrooms, it's true with firms. So when you increase competition, the frontier firms, they do more to escape competition. Those who are behind do less. But the more developed the country is, the more blue firms you have compared to yellow firms, to orange firms. So the more developed the country is, the more growth-enhancing innovation is, okay? And that's the first prediction. But you see, already tells you that whether competition is good or bad depends particularly on the stage of development. The more developed you are, the more growth-enhancing is to have competition, okay? So that's what I want to, an idea. But this idea is very generalized to other things. Competition is that when you are innovation-based, there are other things you want to do. So I will talk now about growth enigma. And what I want to talk is about what we call the middle income trap. So when I was at Harvard, I used to say that the MIT, because MIT was the competitor of Harvard, you see middle income trap, and that's very unfair, but MIT, they're fantastic. They're as good as Harvard. So that was a bad joke. So the idea there is that productivity growth is generated both by imitation and frontier innovation. But when you are a catching up country, like China or like emerging countries, you rely more on imitation. When you are a frontier country, you rely more on frontier innovation. But the policies that are good for catching up are not the same policies as the ones that are good for frontier innovation. I already spoke about competition, but there are other guys like that. For example, if you are in the business of frontier innovation, you need higher education, you need graduate schools. Okay? If you are catching up, it's no big deal if you don't have graduate schools. If you are, you want, as I said, competition, you want generally liberalized product market, but you also want liberalized labor market, because when you are innovation-based, you have creative destruction, you create and you destroy. So you need to hire and lay off easily, and you need, of course, that's why I like Denmark very much, they found a good way to reconcile labor market flexibility and training and education and people being happy, okay? So, so that's, we'll talk about that later on. You also need equity financing, because you see, to finance someone was a good idea. Usually this person will not have collateral, and you want the upside. So when you are a financier of a very innovative firm, the most appropriate instrument is venture capital, business angels, private equity. When you are in the business of financing something very traditional, bank finance, it's not to say that banks do not play a role for innovation, but the more innovative you are, the more equity financing matters. When you are imitative, it's not important. And the problem of the middle income trap is that, that's again my curve with competition, and that's education. But the problem with the middle income trap is that you had some countries that had what you need to catch up. What you need to catch up is the following things. What you need to catch up is foster technology transfers, like what China does. So you need good basic education, maybe good undergraduate education. That's good enough to attract FDI, okay? Another source of catching up is reallocating factors. You need good factor reallocation. And the third one is good management practices. I have my friends on Renan and Bloom, and they've shown, you see here they have surveys worldwide on the quality of management. And you see it's very interesting because at the very top you have US, they have the best scores for management practices, Japan, Germany, then you have Sweden, France is a bit below, then you have Poland, then you have emerging markets, and underneath you have South Latin America, and at the very top, at the very bottom you have Africa. Okay, it's very much the countries you would believe in. So that's the management practice. So those are sorts of catching up. And you see, what's good for catching up is also good, but when you want to innovate, you need on top the graduate schools, the liberalized product market, the liberalized labor market, and equity financing. And the problem of some various countries is that they started having good institutions for the catching up growth, but then they had to switch to innovation-based growth because, you know, at some moment you catch up, so you need to rely more on innovation. And that's where people oppose, because typically you have, in the process of catching up, you have large conglomerates that emerge, like dinosaurs, and those, they oppose the transition to competition. Like, for example, in Japan, you have the Keiretsus, they become like big mastodons, and they escape, they oppose the transition to. In Korea, it's the chobols, whatever you call them, that are big. And in France, you know, also you have large firms, and they try to get all the money from the state, like Alstom recently. I will talk about Alstom in a moment, because I want to provoke a bit my commissioner, you know. I want to make sure she's not bored with me. Okay, so that's the thing. And why do you get middle income or some trap, or above middle income, is that people, they don't switch from the imitation-based institutions to the innovation-based institution, because there is political economy. To go from one to the other, you have big vested interests that oppose the move to the institutions that would push for the innovation. And that's the middle income trap, you see. And France is facing this kind of problem. We have to reform France. Germany will never take France seriously as long as France doesn't reform. Italy, you have a fantastic guy who is called Renzi. He's trying to reform and nobody's helping him. But that's another thing. Okay, you should help the reformers. Okay. I want to talk briefly about the secular stagnation. Secular stagnation. You have my friend Bob Gordon. Bob Gordon, he believes, his view is this. You say, you know, in fact, I'm not showing you had a wave, because those are waves. It's the wave of productivity in the US. And you had a big wave before, which was the steam engine. Why is it a wave? It's a general purpose technology, steam engine, and you diffuse it to the whole economy. It was a huge thing, of course, steam engine. Then you have the wave that you see here, the second one, is the electricity chemistry. Okay? That's the second wave, and that's why you could have Fordism and all that, thanks to electricity. And then you have the third wave, which is internet. And Gordon's view is true. You see, they seem to be smaller and smaller. And his view of the innovation process is to say it's like a fruit-bearing tree. You know, fruit tree, the nice fruits you catch easily. And then, when you have to climb more, first you can fall. Me, I cannot go, I have vertigo. Already on this, I have vertigo here already on this process of this one. But also when you take the fruits that are more remote, they are more bitter, you know. Well, so that's, Gordon has the view of the innovation process, like the fruit-bearing tree. I disagree with Gordon. It's nice to disagree. He's a guy I like very much, Robert Gordon. But I have 3 disagreements with Gordon. And my disagreements are 3 things. First is Dave Jorgensen. He says the following, Dave Jorgensen. He says, look, the ICT revolution, you know, the information telecommunication communication revolution, TIC in French, we say TIC, les TIC. They had a big effect. Not only they improved the productivity of production of goods and services, but the ICT revolution changed the technology to produce ideas. Now I can correspond. I have co-authors in California. I have co-authors in Australia. I have, you know, Dropbox and Skype. Changed my life. I can interact much better. So the technology to produce ideas has never been as good as it is now. Second thing, if I make a big innovation, because of globalization, I can get grants from everywhere. I can be very rich. So I have huge incentives to innovate. 3, there are obvious areas like renewable energies, like health, like computer, the clouds and all that, you know, the 3D printing, where there will be huge revolution. Maybe tomorrow you can photocopy your liver, and if your liver has problems, you put the photocopy, and then, you know, you are safe and you have long life, whatever I'm saying. But you know, obviously there are things, that all goes against Gordon. And you can never predict the next big wave. Of course, you cannot say when it will happen exactly. But you know the probability. You know the probability is very high. You cannot say it's tomorrow, but you can say high probability. So that's my first reason, is Gordon, is the fact that, you know, the technology has changed to produce it. The second reason is the work I'm doing now on missing growth. We don't know how to measure growth. And I want just to show this diagram. This diagram on the horizontal axis shows productivity growth measured in the US, and the vertical shows the number of patents. And what's very interesting is that when you put one and the other, I can look here at the correlation between growth and patents. We've seen that in the US there's been an acceleration in the rate of patents, and also in the quality of patents. And you don't see that in the growth, because they don't know how to measure growth in the US. You see the problem, why they don't know? Because when you measure growth, you can measure nominal growth, but the nominal is the product of the price times the quantity. You don't know what is due to quality and what is due to price. When you have a good that existed yesterday and today, you know it's the same quality of good, you know it's on inflation. Or if it's a good that was a marginal improvement, you know by how much it improved, and you can decompose between inflation and the improvement in productivity. But when you have a new product replacing an old product, you don't know, and you know what they do? It's a secret. You know what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does? Imputation. Imputation. What they do, it's terrible. They use the existing goods to impute what's brought by the new goods. And you know how we call that in Europe? Extrapolation. Don't repeat it. And because they do that, you know how much growth they lose in the US? 1%. 1 percentage point per year is lost, is missed by the calculation of the growth. So if now they say they are at 1.5 in the US, in fact they are at 2.5 GFP growth. So if Gordon calls that stagnation, I'd be very happy, because in my country, Michel Sapin, who is the finance minister, when we are at 0, he thinks it's very good news. So imagine if we were at 2.5%. So, well, that's about the stagnation. There is nothing like secular stagnation in the US. You can have waves, but we are not at the stagnation. They are currently, the US, at 2.5 productivity growth. So there is no stagnation in the US, I can tell you. Okay, third thing, inequality. By the way, what's very interesting also, the third reason that makes me optimistic is that in Europe, we have Europe, and Europe we have the qualities of our defects. Is because many of us were not that good, there was a lot of room for improvement. And let me give the example of Sweden. Sweden is on the right-hand side of my diagram. In Sweden, in the early 90s, they had a tax system as bad as currently France is. Pretty much as bad. You would discourage any kind of innovation. You would have maximum tax rates below the, out of oblivion, okay? And they decided they would keep their social model, but have a tax system which is inducive of innovation. They had a maximum tax rate at 90% or above. They put the maximum tax rate on labor income at 57%. They put the tax rate on capital income at 30%. They understood that you should not tax capital like labor, like some people say even in my country, and they are wrong. And the third thing they did, they put corporate income tax at 20%. What happened is that, in fact, growth took off. Look at the growth in Sweden. There is a takeoff. And in fact, the fiscal income, the tax revenues increased as a result, and they could preserve the social model. Education is free in Sweden, health is free in Sweden. You have active labor market policies, but you also have innovation and growth, you see. Whereas Japan, which is not reforming and where people get older and older, you see it's exactly the opposite from Sweden. You can see that? They're getting less and less growth. And I will tell you about other countries. I wanted to tell you about inequality and social mobility. How long do I have? For how long have I spoken so far? How long do I have left? 20 minutes? Okay. So inequality, social mobility. Number of people have said, look, there is a problem, is that if you look at the share of income of the top 1% income in the US, of the top 1% income earners, over the past 8 years, it has gone up. And it's true for the top 0.1. We all agree on that. The question is, what happened? What is the source of increase in the top income? And with Blondel and others, we argue that innovation is one of these sources. In fact, what we do is here, I have two curves. The red curve is the share of income in the US of the top 1%. It has accelerated for the past 30 years. But the blue curve is the patent flow. It has also accelerated. That's no proof of causality. But in fact, we show that there is a causality. So what you can show, in fact, is that innovation, you see what it does. The red curve shows the effect of innovation On the top one income, you see that wherever, so the horizontal axis, it's a state in a year. So we do cross-state panel, we look at cross states in the US over the years. So the same state can be in different points on the horizontal axis. But what's important is that you have a positive causality from innovation to top income, because when you have more innovation, you have more rents of innovation. Of course, when you innovate, you get rents. But what's interesting is that the blue curve is the broad inequality, is the Gini, and you see no effect of innovation on the broad inequality. So it's true that innovation is a source of top income, but it does not increase broad inequality. Why? Because innovation has a virtue. It also creates social mobility. Why it creates social mobility? Because of creative destruction. Because the old replaces the new. It's a force of social mobility, innovation. And what we showed in the same study is that, in fact, you have a positive relationship between innovation and social mobility. Where you have more innovation, you have the children's income depends less on the parents' income. Wherever you have more innovation, your future income depends less on your initial income. And I showed that on aggregate data. I've done a study on Finland that shows that on individual data. So innovation, it's true that it increases top income inequality, but it gives you growth, it increases social mobility, and it does not increase inequality at large. Whereas lobbying, it's a very different story. If you have lobbying increases top income inequality, like innovation, but increases inequality at large. It reduces social mobility, and it does not enhance growth. It prevents growth because you put entry barriers. What I used to say is that Steve Jobs is not the same as Carlos Slim. Do you know who Carlos Slim is? One day I will be murdered, you will know who. Carlos Slim, I'm joking. Carlos Slim is a rich Mexican who became very rich because Carlos Salinas was his friend, privatized Telecom de Mexico. It's a crazy, I was married with a Mexican. I did not divorce because of that. I did not divorce because it was too expensive to call the family. That's not the reason. But it would cost 10 times as much to call Mexico than to call anywhere else, because it was essentially a non-regulated monopoly. And Mr. Carlos Slim became very rich because of that. It was a monopoly. That's very different from Steve Jobs, who is an innovator. So what I say is that, be careful. When you talk about inequality, which inequality are you talking about? Is it top income inequality? Is it the Gini? Is it social mobility? It's not the same thing. When you talk about the source of top income inequality, what are you talking about? Innovation or lobbying and rents? And you should not treat the two the same way. You should not be. So anybody who believes that it's all grants and there is no innovation, they are wrong. You have to, treat differently those. And now, not that you shouldn't worry about the top 1%. The top 1%, they may still use their wealth to prevent new innovators. But that you can deal not only with tax policy, but with competition policy. There I go to my commissioner. She said, well, competition policy can prevent. Who is the richest man in Sweden today? Is Mr. Skype. Now, when I say Mr. Skype, it's not fair, because I think the one who invented the system is Danish, isn't it? There are two people, but one of them is Swedish, okay? So he's the richest man in Sweden. Maybe the other one is richest in Denmark. But he's as rich as Wallenberg or whatever. He did not exist 20 years ago. I don't mind as long as social mobility has not gone down, but it has not gone down in Sweden. And the Gini has gone up a little bit, but not that much. My worry could be that Mr. Skype used the wealth that he has to prevent new entry. But for that, competition policy is important. The rules to finance political campaigns, for example, Scalia, peace to his soul, died, the Supreme Court, but the bad thing they did was to allow companies in the US to finance political campaigns with no bound. That's bad, because that allows the incumbents to bias the competition. So you see that you must have when you are Schumpeterian, you have a broader view on how you deal with this kind of problem, okay? That's what I wanted to say on inequality. I think you are dead by now. Huh? You are dead, huh? Okay. The last one is the firm dynamics. And because that's important, and I'm almost done now. We are at the end. Take a breath. We are almost done. You have suffered and you are brave, okay? So I want to look at firm dynamics. Look, the figure on the top is the US. It represents the size of a US firm as a function of the age. So on the horizontal axis you have an age of a firm, and on the vertical axis you have the size of a firm. And that's for my commissioner. So what you see is that in the US you grow with age. When you are good, you grow. When you are in Mexico and India, you stop growing fast. Why do you stop growing? Because you have credit constraints, maybe because you don't trust the firm to people who are not your family, because there is not a good judiciary system, because infrastructure is not there. But the fact is, in France also, firms don't grow. You have startups that they don't grow. And the problem is, and why is that the problem? Because it's like a Darwinian process. You want the good guys to grow and the bad ones not to grow. When I look at the distribution of productivities in India and US, you see that it's much more skewed to the right in the US. You have very few firms that are non-productive in the US because they are eaten up or beat by the good ones that grow. In India, because when you are good, you stop growing even though you are good, you leave room for inefficient firms to be there. But that means that the aggregate innovation is less in India than in the US. And whenever you do industrial policy, and there may be a case for industrial policy, that's the debate I want to have with the Commissioner. It's important not only to have the incumbent firms, because then you may prevent a new one to come. And that may bias you towards an Indian type of distribution of firm size. And that's why when you do industrial policy, if you decide that, for example, the health sector is important, or the renewable energy is important, you should have everybody, not just the champions, and including the entrants. And that's what I always said, Juncker got it right. But now, since today, I know that it's Juncker. Okay, good. But anyway, those are good ideas. I mean, whatever it is, I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it's a very innovative idea. So what I want to do now is fostering growth in Europe. Why is Europe less resilient than the US? And some people have blamed the fact that the sequencing of policies was bad in Europe. Okay, that after the crisis, what did they do in the US? What did they do in the US? They did stress tests for the banks. They dealt with a bad loan problem. They did a deleveraging, but with no recessions because they had a very conducive, they had a fiscal stimulus, and they had Obama helping General Motors, and they had my friend Bernard Bernanke was doing quantity easing. What did Europe do? Europe, they right away, very quickly, they didn't do the quantity easing until recently, and they never did it completely, okay? And too quickly, they started to do budgetary restriction. So they did the sequencing wrong. And they did the stress test very late with the banks. So they did it upside down. That's what my friend Pisani-Ferry has been saying. That certainly is part of the story why Europe is not growing as fast. But I think there are deeper reasons than that, okay? And the reason is first that there are two things that the US have and that a number of European countries don't have. First, they have a more proactive macro policy. That's for sure. They are more counter-cyclical. They lower interest rate more, they do more quantity easing in recession and more budgetary in recession. But the other thing they do is that they have more flexible product and labor market. I told you that for an innovation-based economy, you need flexible product and labor market. And it turns out that both are complementary. I have done a study on that, and the study I've done is to say, look, I looked at the effect of a more counter-cyclical monetary policy. On the left, you have countries with low barriers to trade and investment, and the effects are big. If you do the same conducive policy in countries with very high, rigid product and labor market, the effect is small. France, for example, is a country with very rigid markets. We had low interest rate, low euro, low price of oil, and in spite of that, growth did not resume in France. Why? Because we don't have flexible product and labor market. And Draghi is totally right. He says there is that much I can do, but the countries need to do their homework. And to do their homework is to do the structural reforms. And that brings me to Europe, and then I will stop because everybody is dead, and the Commissioner must leave soon. Draghi said we need both. And my view is the following. That's my conclusion, and my last two slides. First, my first thing is if we want to revive the idea of Europe, people to love Europe, Europe has to deliver growth, okay? If you don't deliver growth, it's over, okay? Second thing, for that you need structural reforms, but you need structural reforms with more proactive policy, and I will get back to that. The second thing is that when you do a reform process, you have to worry about the losers. Because if you don't, you get Brexit in England and you get Trump in the US, okay? That takes me there. Of course, so the first idea is that you need the pact between, there will be a new president probably in France. Okay, I'm very, I would not bet anything on the current president to be re-elected, okay? And there will be a new president. My hope is that this new president will talk to Mrs. Merkel and say, look, I will do structural reforms in France. And I will do them. And you will see that I will do them. Once it's done, because the Germans think that we are parole. We talk the French and we don't do anything, okay? We will do the reforms. Now that we've done it, we've sweated, we've done the sweating. We want you to be more proactive. You need to invest, for example, in your own infrastructure. You know, I took a train from Lindau to Munich in Germany. I was coughing all the time because it's diesel traction. You know, they should electrify the line between Lindau and Munich so that I don't cough next time. You know, I don't need to have my Ventolin when I take the train in Germany. Okay, so they need to invest in infrastructure, but we need to do the structural reforms. And both are complementary. We know they are both good, but on the other hand, it's also good because if France does the structural reforms, Germany will trust France. So it's a win-win. We will gain, if France does the structural reforms, and other countries like France, we will gain the trust of Germany, and they will be willing to be more infrastructure and more doing things that will be good for the macroeconomy. And it turns out that both are good for growth, because we get back to Draghi, who got it right on this. That's the idea. And the last thing is that you want to compensate the losers. You see, the problem is that if you have people uneducated and with no hope of the future, and you see that's only the Thatcher and Reagan. They understood that you had to do structural reform, but they operated the patient without anesthetic. You see, that's the problem. And they didn't care about the losers. And the problem is that now we get it in the face. The losers give you Trump in the US and Brexit in the UK. You need in particular to make sure you invest in education. I admire those countries in Europe that decide that education should be high quality for everybody. Finland, the Scandinavian, the Renans, whatever. And it's very important to have good education, to have a labor market system. Whenever you lose your job, you have income guarantee, good training, and help in finding a new job. So I know Denmark has been extremely forefront on that. Others do. You have the active labor market policies in Germany. Those are good things. They should be emulated. And whenever I was talking to Larry Summers in the US and he said, oh, we should not pay too much attention to labor market policy, now they pay the price for it. You see what I mean? So that's very important. And you should reward the reformers. Renzi did a very courageous labor market reform. He needed help to deal with the bad loan problem with his banks. He should have got that help. He didn't. He might lose the referendum as a result. And that's terrible when you don't encourage reformers. As much as I agree with Germany, being tough on France as long as France doesn't reform, those reforms should be encouraged and rewarded. I think that's very important. Even if we don't go federal, we are a Europe of countries and nations. The nations should encourage each other in getting the policy package right. And finally, I go to the industrial policy. The industrial policy should be more competition-friendly. I agree with sectoral state aid in some cases, but they should be pro-competition, pro-entry, and have exit mechanism. That if the money doesn't work well, you have mechanism to exit. And I think the ideas that you've been pushing, that Juncker has been pushing, that you are sympathetic to, that's the way to think. And in France, the disaster. France is exactly the way not to do. There is a company in France called Alstom. Okay, TGV is Alstom. It's a very decent company. But maybe because they had, I'm sorry for this, maybe because they had they were relying too much on public contracts, they did not innovate as much as they should have in high-speed trains and in freight engines. And so others became better than they did. They said now to America, but it's not the high speed. You do the Acela Express that goes, it's not on the high-speed line. So that's the thing. So what you should do is more like Obama. When Obama decided to help General Motors, he had General Motors to improve. But what Francis just done, it was about 400 people having to be moved 200 kilometers. I would have paid the Ritz Hotel to them, you see what I mean? But instead of that, they went for a more expensive solution than the Ritz Hotel. They decided to put to force the SNCF, which is the French railway, to not buy freight engines from the German company, and they forced the SNCF to buy TGV that they are putting on a low-speed line. This is not right industrial policy, because you see, industrial policy, that's where the political economy is important. You should go for the entrance and everybody, but of course the politician wants to go where it's more visible, and those are the big incumbents. And you can see that the political economy pushes you the wrong way. That's why I think the European Commission is important. And my view, when I was talking to Almunia, was to say, look, you used to have a view vis-à-vis industrial policy which was very much legalistic ex ante, a priori no sectoral state aid. What happened is that many countries did the state aid without saying, it's what I call the don't ask, don't tell in industrial policy. You see, like in the army, the US, you don't say you're homosexual and whatever. Same thing in industrial policy. Don't ask, don't tell. Instead, you should acknowledge there is a sectoral state aid, but you should insist on the governance. You do it. I want to make sure that you go for competitive sectors and that you have governance rules that are, and that's why the Competition Commission should be involved in the governance as well of the industrial policy. Let people have sectoral state aid, but if it reduces competition, and you can see that, then you can intervene ex post and say, no, you didn't do right. I have no a priori against it, as long as competition is preserved. That's why I very much thought that industrial policy and competition policy should work hand in hand in Brussels, and that's not yet the case. And that's why it's so important. And you know the funny story I have now, it's about Britain. I am part of the Growth Commission at the LSE, and they think about industrial policy. And they said, you know what's great in Europe is that we have the Competition Commission and we have our friend here. They can be there to monitor you. The problem in Britain is who will monitor us now that we are no longer in Europe. So they need to stay in Europe, you know. It would be good for them. They could have smart industrial policy, which is pro-single market. And that will conclude my speech. Thank you so much.